Holiday lunches in my family have always carried a strange tension, but this year it broke in a way I could never unhear. One moment I was reaching for the bread basket, offering it across the table like I'd done since childhood. The next, my mother looked at me with a coolness that didn't match the festive glow around us and told me, without warning, without preamble, that I needed to stop leaning on the family. Her voice cut through the clatter of dishes. Forks froze. Conversation died mid-breath. And not a single person came to my defense. Not my father, who suddenly found the pattern of his plate fascinating. Not my brothers, who sat in a practiced silence that felt like complicity. Not even the relatives whose lives had quietly depended on my help for years. I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, but clarity, the kind that arrives quietly but rearranges everything. I didn't storm out. I didn't argue. I sat there for a few seconds, letting the yellow dining room light wash over me the way it used to when I was a child who believed those lights meant warmth instead of warning. My name is Valentina. I'm 42. I have navigated leadership roles, budgets, crises, but somehow in this house, I've always been the daughter who tries too hard, the sibling who does too much, yet the one everyone relies on in some unspoken, inherited agreement. My mother, Carol, has always controlled the emotional climate of the house. Warm when she wanted admiration, cold when she wanted obedience. Today, she was midwinter. My brothers reacted in predictable ways. Stephen pretended his phone needed all his attention, even though the screen was dark. Bobby swirled his wine with a smirk, as if waiting for a show he'd rehearsed in his head for years. And still, I stayed silent, choosing observation over reaction. Because silence, I've learned, reveals more truth than words ever could. As they resumed their artificial small talk, I noticed how badly they wanted to pretend nothing had happened, the too loud laughs, the jittery tapping of forks, the strained attempts to restart a rhythm that no longer existed. But something had happened. Something irreversible. And in the middle of processing all of it, I remembered something important. Before we continue the story, please tell me in the comments what your name is and where you are listening from, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Their conversation continued around me, but I had already crossed an invisible line, one they didn't see shift. Because they believed I relied on them. They were about to learn the truth. But the moment my mother repeated those same chilling words later that afternoon, everything in me changed, and that was the beginning of a break none of them saw coming. The rest of the lunch unfolded like a staged performance everyone wanted to end but no one dared interrupt. I sat quietly, observing the uneven rhythm of the room, the too loud clinks of cutlery, the forced chuckles breaking through strained breaths, the way my father's shoulder tightened every time my mother shifted beside him. Even the holiday decorations seemed to dim, like they knew the temperature had dropped far below winter. Carol, of course, pretended nothing had happened. She went on about the ham glaze, the neighbors' renovations, the weather forecast, anything except the blow she had delivered to her own daughter. Not once did she look in my direction. That was her real talent. She didn't lash out, she erased, and being erased by your mother is a wound that stings deeper than anger ever could. Eventually, Stephen spoke, still staring at his plate as if afraid to lift his eyes. "Mom's not wrong, Val," he muttered. "You've been distant lately. Maybe this is just overdue." Distant. A word people use when they've forgotten every sacrifice you made because it was too convenient to acknowledge. I didn't respond. Then Bobby chimed in, swirling his wine like he was narrating a drama for an invisible audience. "If you're struggling, you could have just said so," he said with faux concern. "Not a crime to need help. If I hadn't been so exhausted, I might have laughed at the absurdity, me needing help from them. But I stayed quiet, watching Bobby's knee bounce in a smug rhythm. Then my mother finally spoke again, her tone soft but sharpened like the edge of a blade. "Valentina, sweetheart," she said. "We can't keep pretending everything is fine. You rely too much on this family. You need to grow up." There it was, the line delivered again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if she wanted to etch every syllable into my skin. But the most painful part wasn't the words. It was the silence that followed them. No one protested. No one questioned her. No one even blinked. They agreed, loudly, through their stillness. That was the moment something inside me aligned, not in rage, but in understanding. A clean, decisive click, like a key sliding into place. I stood from the table shortly after, excusing myself to the bathroom. Not to cry, I didn't feel tears, only truth sharpening in my chest. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, not because she had changed, but because she finally saw clearly. When I walked back to the table, they didn't even look up. And that told me everything. But nothing prepared them for what I did next, a quiet decision that would flip the balance of power in a way none of them expected. When I returned to the dining room, my chair made a soft scrape against the floor, a sound that should have drawn at least one pair of eyes. But no one looked up. Not my mother, not my father, not either of my brothers. The message was unmistakable, my absence hadn't been noticed, and my presence didn't matter. That was when the decision crystallized inside me. I reached for my coat, draping it over my arm with a calmness that almost surprised me. Carol finally glanced in my direction, irritation flickering across her face as though I had interrupted a carefully rehearsed moment. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Home," I replied, steady and clear. For a brief second, something unreadable passed through her expression, confusion, maybe a flicker of fear, before she smothered it under her usual mask. She didn't try to stop me. Neither did the others. I walked to the door without a backward glance, not because I was angry, but because they had not earned even a final look. The cold air outside hit me like a truth I had ignored for far too long. By the time I reached my apartment, the numbness had faded, leaving behind a kind of quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. My home, once merely a retreat from the noise of life, suddenly became the only place where my thoughts made sense. I didn't sit down. I didn't pace. I walked straight to my bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Not because I was leaving, but because I needed to mark the end of something. Folding clothes felt symbolic, each piece a boundary I should have drawn a long time ago. After packing quietly, I set the suitcase aside and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the room with a cool blue light as I began reviewing accounts I had kept running for years, utilities for my parents' house, maintenance for the cabin, tuition assistance, medical bills, repairs, all the invisible support they had taken for granted. The numbers didn't shock me. I had lived them. But seeing everything compiled in one place was like watching the truth laid out in black and white. I hovered over the autopay settings. And then, without hesitation, I canceled every one of them. Not out of spite. Out of logic. They had told me to stop relying on the family. So I did, in the most literal way possible. Next came the cabin, the internet, the heating, the maintenance contracts. I clicked through each account with steady, deliberate motions. Cancel. 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 Each confirmation felt like closing a door I should never have walked through in the first place. But the biggest shift came when I opened the folder I hadn't touched in years, the one containing the cabin transfer documents. The reversion clause sat there, clear as day. And for the first time I understood the full power of what I'd signed. Because the moment they tried to challenge me, that quiet clause I had forgotten about would ignite a chain reaction they never saw coming. Days passed quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but intentional. I moved through my routines with an unfamiliar lightness, a sense that something long overdue had finally begun. The cabin accounts were closed. The utilities at my parents' home were no longer tethered to my bank. My phone stayed silent, until it didn't. On the third morning, Bobby's name flashed across my screen. I let it ring twice. He needed to feel the delay. "Val, what the hell did you do?" he demanded the moment I answered, skipping any greeting. His voice was sharp with indignation, as if he were the one who'd been wronged. "The cabin's freezing. The heat won't kick on, and the internet's gone. Mason was supposed to go up this weekend. Then he'll have to stay home," I replied evenly. "What is your problem?" he shouted, disbelief cracking through every word. You can't just cut everything off. I stopped paying for things I don't use, I said calmly. There was a beat of silence, a stunned, sputtering silence, before he launched into a lecture about family responsibility, loyalty, sacrifice. Words people love to use when they expect something from you. I let him finish. You told me to stop relying on the family, I said softly. So I did. And then I ended the call. The next message wasn't a call but a voicemail from my father, a trembling, overly reasonable tone asking if we could discuss this like adults. Not concern. Not remorse. Just panic laced with entitlement. 2 more days passed. Then the real escalation arrived. A thick envelope with a law office's return address sat in my mailbox, heavy enough to tell me everything before I even opened it. Inside was a formal petition filed by my mother. She claimed she'd been under emotional distress when she signed the cabin transfer papers. She asked the court to revert ownership back to her and my father. They didn't reach out. They didn't ask questions. They went straight to trying to take something they believed was theirs. The silence in my kitchen felt electric as I read the documents. Not painful, clarifying. Their choice made everything simple now. I called my lawyer that afternoon. He scanned the paperwork, sighed, and gave a small, almost pitying shake of his head. They triggered the clause, he said. By contesting the agreement, ownership automatically returns to you. Effective immediately. They have no legal standing. For the first time in months, I felt something solid beneath my feet, certainty, not anger. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. And it was only beginning. Because when I agreed to meet them face to face, they had no idea I was walking in with 20 years of truth they could no longer run from. I chose the meeting place carefully, not a home, not an office, but the old diner near our childhood neighborhood. The one with flickering neon lights and cracked leather booths. Neutral ground. Public enough that no one could raise their voice. Familiar enough that none of us could pretend we were strangers. I arrived early and sat in the back booth, the one with a humming light overhead. When they walked in, my mother rigid as marble, my father avoiding my eyes, Stephen pale, Bobby bristling with anger, they looked less like a family and more like a group called into a courtroom. They slid into the booth across from me. No greetings. Carol spoke first. Valentina, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. I studied her expression. Annoyance, not remorse. Irritation that her plan hadn't unfolded the way she imagined. Mom, I said evenly, I didn't file anything. That's because you blindsided us, she snapped. Cutting off the cabin, the bills, you can't expect us to manage that suddenly. I didn't expect anything, I replied. That's the difference. Her jaw tightened, but before she could interrupt again, I placed a folder on the table. Not legal papers, my records. 20 years worth of payments, printed line by line. Utilities. Tuition. Medical bills. Repairs. The quiet contributions they had built their comfort on. Stephen leaned forward first, voice barely above a whisper. What is this? Everything I've covered since I was 22, I said. My father picked up the first page. His eyes moving slowly down each line. He stopped halfway through. You paid this much? Yes. For all of us? Stephen murmured, stunned. Yes. Bobby scoffed, but the sound was brittle. So what? You think this makes you some kind of hero? We never asked you to. No, I cut in, calm but firm. You expected it. You benefited from it. You relied on it. A line fell across the table like a verdict. Then I slid one more document forward, the reversion clause. This, I said, is the agreement for the cabin. When you contested the ownership, you activated the clause. Everything reverted to me automatically. You didn't lose the cabin because of my actions. You lost it because you tried to take something that was never yours to claim. My mother's face strained. For the first time in my life, she looked shaken, not furious, not manipulative, but afraid. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. My father leaned back, stunned. Stephen stared at the table. Bobby's mouth opened, then closed. For once, none of them had a script. I let the silence stretch, heavy enough to force honesty into the room. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said quietly. "I'm doing this because I should have set boundaries 20 years ago. You say I relied on this family. But you were all relying on me." I reached into my wallet and placed a single dollar bill in the center of the table. "That's all that remains. Everything else I already gave, and you never saw it." No one moved. I stood. "Valentina," my mother called, voice cracking. But I didn't turn back. Some endings don't need dramatic exits. They just need a door that finally closes. But what happened afterward, when the dust settled and the consequences sank in, changed everything in a way none of us could have predicted. The diner door closed behind me with a soft chime, and for the first time in a long while, the sound didn't feel like loss, it felt like release. Outside, the cold air wrapped around me, sharp but clarifying, like it was helping me breathe out years of silent burdens I never should have carried. Over the next few days, the quiet in my apartment felt different. It wasn't the silence of being shut out, or the heavy stillness that comes from trying not to upset anyone. This quiet was gentle. Earned. A space where I finally existed without being measured by what I could provide. Sunlight filtered through my blinds in soft, warm lines each morning, and for once, I didn't wake expecting a family crisis waiting on the other end of my phone. I didn't brace myself for a guilt-filled voicemail or a passive-aggressive message demanding explanations. Everything felt still. Balanced. My lawyer called to confirm the last of the paperwork. The cabin was officially, legally mine again. No negotiation. No loopholes. The reversion clause had been triggered by their own actions, and the law left no room for argument. He asked if I wanted to pursue damages or file anything further. I didn't. Consequences had already found their way to where they belonged. I had no interest in extending the battle. Justice doesn't have to roar to be real. A week later, an email arrived from my father. It was short, almost shockingly short. No justifications. No grand speeches. Just a single line telling me they were figuring things out. I hoped they were. Not out of bitterness, but because maybe, without the financial safety net they'd grown accustomed to, they would finally learn the responsibilities they had assumed were mine alone. As for me, I took a long walk along the river that weekend. Winter air brushed cold against my cheeks, carrying the scent of water and distant pine. With every step, something inside me settled further. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. I simply felt lighter. I hadn't abandoned my family. I had just stopped abandoning myself. That realization washed over me like a quiet revelation, the kind that doesn't need applause or witnesses. The kind that finally lets your shoulders drop after years of involuntary tension. Maybe one day they would understand the boundary I drew. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I had finally chosen myself. And that choice changed everything. But just when I thought the story had reached its end, something unexpected happened, something that revealed where the real healing would begin. In the days that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt strangely new, yet deeply overdue. I found myself noticing things I had been too exhausted to see before, the way the light warmed the edges of my bookshelves in the afternoon, the calm hum of the city drifting through my windows, the quiet peace of making a cup of tea without a knot forming in my stomach. I didn't realize how heavily I had lived under constant expectation until it was gone. For the first time in years, I wasn't anticipating a crisis. I wasn't waiting for a call that demanded money, solutions, or emotional labor I no longer had to spare. My evenings belonged to me. My mornings did too. It felt like reclaiming lost territory inside myself. And then something unexpected happened. I woke one morning to find a small box at my door, no return address, no note, just a simple brown package sealed neatly. I brought it inside with cautious curiosity. When I opened the lid, I found a photograph inside, a picture of the cabin taken years ago, before the repairs, before the updates, before the burden of it had landed squarely on my shoulders. Behind the photo was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't signed. The handwriting wasn't familiar or dramatic. It was painfully simple. "We should have appreciated you sooner." No excuses. No demands. Just 7 words that carried the weight of years. I didn't know which of them had sent it, my father, Stephen, maybe even Bobby, but I knew it wasn't from my mother. Carol had never been one for apologies, silent or otherwise. Still, something in me softened, not because the gesture fixed anything, but because it finally acknowledged what had been true all along: I had given more than anyone realized. And even though the road ahead was still complicated, those 7 words felt like the first stone placed on the foundation of something different, not reconciliation, but recognition. Later that evening, I stood on my balcony, holding the photograph against the winter sky. The cabin looked small in the picture, almost fragile. For the first time, I saw it not as a weight, but as something I had reclaimed for myself, not through revenge, but through truth. My phone buzzed on the table behind me. A message. From one of them. I didn't open it right away. For once, I let my time matter more than their urgency. And in that moment, I realized the story wasn't ending. It was shifting. Because when I finally opened that message hours later, what I read changed the entire direction of what came next, in a way I never expected. Hours passed before I finally picked up my phone. I'd let the message sit, unread, not out of spite but because I no longer reacted on command. When I finally opened it, I saw my father's name at the top of the screen. The text was short, just a few lines, almost hesitant. "We're trying to sort things out. I hope you're doing okay." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to reclaim control. It was simply human. And that alone was different from the pattern we had lived in for so long. I didn't reply right away. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something important: I didn't owe anyone immediate access to my peace, not anymore. In the quiet that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me here: the years of carrying responsibilities that weren't mine, the unspoken expectation that I would always fix what broke around me, the love I kept offering in hopes it would one day be returned without conditions. But those expectations had fallen away now, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow unfurling of truth. One evening, I walked along the river again. The wind was crisp, carrying the soft scent of pine and cold water. I paused at the railing and let my thoughts settle. For the first time in my life, there was no weight pressing down on my shoulders, no unspoken demands, no quiet fear of disappointing someone who would never admit they needed me in the first place. It felt like breathing with new lungs. The cabin paperwork arrived in the mail a few days later, the final confirmation that it was legally mine. Holding the documents, I felt nothing vindictive. Just relief. Not because I had gained something, but because I had reclaimed what had always been taken for granted. I placed the photograph from the anonymous package beside the paperwork. The cabin looked different in the image now, not as a symbol of burden, but as a reminder of what happens when truth finally steps into the light. Maybe my family would change. Maybe they wouldn't. Healing wasn't guaranteed simply because consequences had arrived. But I had learned that my worth wasn't tied to their recognition, and my value didn't hinge on sacrifices they never fully saw. I didn't abandon them. I stopped abandoning myself. That was the real turning point. As the days stretched forward, I found a steadiness I hadn't known I was missing, a life where my time, my energy, and my peace belonged finally and fully to me. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. And if you want more powerful, true life stories about growth, boundaries, and freedom, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next.